Francis Lopez had conquered boardrooms on 3 continents and closed deals worth hundreds of millions. But none of that prepared him for the moment he stepped into his own mansion and saw his daughter, his only child, standing in the foyer dressed like the help. Liana, 12 years old with her mother's soft brown eyes, stood barefoot on marble floors that had once echoed with her laughter, now holding a feather duster in hands that should have been holding paintbrushes or storybooks, anything but cleaning tools. And right behind her, wearing a smile that felt rehearsed and cruel, stood Carolyn, the woman he'd married to give his daughter a mother, the woman who had turned his home into a prison he didn't even know existed. What Francis did next didn't just save his daughter. It became a lesson in why showing up matters more than any apology ever could. If you walked in on this, would you confront her on the spot or gather proof first, and why? Drop your take in the comments. Be honest even if it feels uncomfortable. Welcome, friend, to a story about the kind of courage it takes to admit you were wrong and the kind of love that refuses to let a child carry burdens alone. If this resonates with you, go ahead and hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to protect the people we love. Settle in, because this one's going to stay with you long after the screen goes dark. The mansion had been quiet for months, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that presses down on your chest and makes you forget how to breathe freely. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles that floated lazily through the air, casting soft shadows across the grand piano that sat untouched in the corner, a relic from a time when music and joy had filled these walls. The scent of jasmine lingered faintly, a reminder of Liana's mother, whose portrait still hung in the library, frozen in a moment of warmth that felt like a lifetime ago. Everything in the house was pristine, polished marble, spotless windows, designer furniture arranged with magazine-level precision, but beneath the surface perfection, something had rotted: trust, safety, the simple belief that home was supposed to be a refuge. This was a house that looked like a dream but felt like a gilded cage, and the person suffering most was too small, too scared, and too loyal to her father to say a word. 6 months earlier, Francis had stood in this same foyer with a woman he believed would bring life back into these walls. Carolyn Mitchell had entered his world at a charity gala, elegant and poised in a champagne silk gown, her laughter light and practiced in all the right ways. She'd spoken fluently about contemporary art, asked thoughtful questions about his real estate ventures, and when she'd knelt to compliment Liana on her dress that evening, Francis had seen what he desperately wanted to see: a woman who could love his daughter the way her mother once had. The courtship had been brief but intoxicating. Carolyn had been patient with Liana's shyness, attending her school recitals and complimenting her artwork with what seemed like genuine warmth. When Francis proposed 3 months later, it was in the library where his late wife's portrait hung, as if seeking her blessing. Liana had been quiet that evening, her small fingers tracing the frame of her mother's picture while Carolyn's diamond engagement ring caught the lamplight. Francis had misread the silence as adjustment, as a child learning to open her heart again. The wedding had been intimate, just close family and a handful of business associates, held in the mansion's garden beneath a canopy of white roses. Liana had been the flower girl, wearing a lavender dress her mother would have loved, her steps careful and measured as she walked down the aisle. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Liana had looked up at her father with eyes that seemed to carry a question she couldn't voice. But the moment passed, and Francis had convinced himself it was nerves. Now, 6 months into the marriage, Francis stood in his office reviewing contracts for a real estate acquisition in Dubai that required his physical presence for 3 weeks. The deal was worth $300 million, the kind of opportunity that had built his empire, but as he packed his briefcase that evening, something nagged at the edges of his consciousness. Liana had been different lately, quieter than usual, her responses during dinner clipped and careful. Her grades had slipped, her art teacher had mentioned she seemed distracted, and twice that week he'd found her asleep at her desk, still in her school uniform. "Daddy, do you really have to go?" Liana asked that evening as he zipped his suitcase in the master bedroom. She stood in the doorway, Her arms wrapped around herself in a way that made her look smaller than 12. Francis knelt to her level, taking her hands in his. "It's only 3 weeks, sweetheart, and then I'll be back, and we'll do whatever you want. Maybe that trip to the art museum you've been asking about." Liana nodded, but her eyes didn't brighten the way they usually did. "Okay," she whispered. Behind them, Carolyn appeared in the doorway, her silk robe flowing as she placed a hand on Liana's shoulder. The girl flinched, so slightly that Francis almost missed it, but Carolyn's smile never wavered. "Don't worry, darling, I'll take excellent care of her," she said, her voice smooth as honey. "We'll have lots of time to bond, won't we, Liana?" Liana's jaw tightened, but she nodded again. "Yes, Carolyn," she said quietly. Francis kissed his daughter's forehead, already mentally running through his flight schedule and meeting agendas. He told himself the tension he felt was simply the stress of leaving, that Carolyn's presence would be good for Liana, that everything would be fine. He didn't see the way Liana's fingers dug into her palms until her knuckles went white. Didn't notice how she held her breath until Carolyn's hand lifted from her shoulder. The next morning, Francis's car pulled out of the circular driveway at dawn, his assistant already on the phone confirming hotel reservations in Dubai. Through the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of Liana standing at her bedroom window, one hand pressed against the glass, but the car turned the corner before he could wave back. Inside the mansion, Carolyn watched the taillights disappear down the palm-lined street, her expression shifting from the practiced warmth she'd worn for Francis to something colder, more calculating. She turned slowly, her heels clicking against the marble as she climbed the stairs to Liana's room. The girl was still at the window, her teddy bear clutched against her chest, when Carolyn pushed open the door without knocking. "Now," Carolyn said, her voice stripped of its earlier sweetness, "let's discuss your new responsibilities." Liana turned, her eyes wide, and in that moment, she understood with terrible clarity that the next 3 weeks would change everything. The mansion's silence seemed to deepen around her, swallowing the last traces of her father's cologne and the safety his presence had provided, however imperfectly. Outside, the California sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the windows, shadows that would stretch across the coming days like a warning Liana was only beginning to comprehend. 3 days after Francis's departure, Liana woke to her alarm at 5:30 a.m., the bedroom still dark except for the pale glow of dawn creeping through her curtains. She reached to turn off the beeping, and that's when she saw it, a gray maid's uniform laid carefully across the foot of her bed, pressed and folded like a gift, with a small white card resting on top. Her hands trembled as she picked up the note, and the handwriting was Carolyn's, elegant and deliberate. "Character is built through service." For a moment, Liana thought it might be some kind of mistake, or maybe a strange joke she didn't understand, but then she heard footsteps in the hallway, and Carolyn's voice came through the door, calm and unervingly cheerful. "You have 15 minutes to get dressed and meet me in the kitchen, Liana," she said, and the sound of her heels clicking away left no room for argument. Liana stared at the uniform, her stomach twisting into knots, and she wanted to call her father to tell him something was wrong. But her phone was downstairs charging, and she knew Carolyn would be watching. So she put on the uniform, the fabric rough against her skin and too big in the shoulders, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the girl staring back. Downstairs, Carolyn was waiting in the kitchen, already dressed in a silk blouse and tailored pants, her coffee steaming on the marble counter. She looked Liana up and down, nodding with satisfaction, and then she smiled in that way that never reached her eyes. "Good," she said. "Now, let's talk about what you'll be learning while your father is away." She explained it all so smoothly, so convincingly, that for a second Liana almost believed her. Carolyn said it was about preparing her for the real world, about understanding what hard work really meant, about honoring the people who kept their home running. "You've been privileged your entire life," Carolyn said, her voice soft but firm, "and it's time you learn gratitude, respect, and responsibility." She made it sound noble, even kind, and when Maria the housekeeper walked in and hesitated at the doorway, Carolyn turned to her with that same calm smile and said, "Maria, doesn't this sound like a wonderful opportunity for Liana to grow?" Maria's eyes met Liana's for just a second, and the girl saw something like pain flicker there, but Maria nodded slowly and said, "Yes, Mrs. Lopez," before turning away to start her own work. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and quiet humiliation. Liana woke before dawn every morning, scrubbed the marble floors on her hands and knees until her palms burned, polished the silverware until it gleamed, and carried breakfast trays to Carolyn's bedroom while the woman lounged in bed scrolling through her phone. Her hands blistered and then calloused, her back ached from bending over mop buckets, and at school she could barely keep her eyes open during class. Her grades slipped from A's to C's, and her friends stopped texting after she ignored their messages for 3 days straight because she was too tired to think of what to say. Maria tried to help once. She found Liana in the laundry room one afternoon, struggling to fold a fitted sheet, tears streaming down her face, and she gently took the sheet from her hands and said, "Mija, this isn't right." But before she could say more, Carolyn appeared in the doorway, her expression cold and sharp, and she pulled Maria aside into the hallway. Liana couldn't hear everything, but she heard enough. Carolyn's voice low and threatening, words like documentation and immigration, and "I'd hate for anyone to start asking questions." When Maria came back into the laundry room, her face was pale, and she wouldn't meet Liana's eyes. Miguel, the gardener, was no different. He'd worked for the Lopez family for 6 years, had taught Liana how to plant roses when she was 7, but now when she passed him in the garden, he looked down at his tools and pretended not to see her. The guilt was written all over his face, but fear kept him silent, and Liana understood that she was truly alone. On the 9th day, Francis called from Dubai. Liana was in the living room dusting picture frames when her father's face appeared on Carolyn's laptop screen, and Carolyn waved her over with a sweet smile that vanished the moment Francis couldn't see her. "Come say hello to your dad, sweetheart," Carolyn said, but as Liana moved closer, Carolyn held up the maid's uniform just out of the camera's view, her eyes locked on the girl in silent warning. "Hey, princess." Francis's voice was warm and tired, and seeing his face made Liana's chest ache so badly she thought she might break. "How's everything going? Are you and Carolyn having fun?" Liana opened her mouth, and for a second she wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but Carolyn's fingers tightened on the uniform, and the words died in her throat. "Everything's fine, Dad," she stammered, her voice flat and distant even to her own ears. "Just tired from schoolwork." Francis leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing, and Liana saw the moment he noticed something was off. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. "You look." But before he could finish, a voice off-screen interrupted him, urgent and insistent, and Francis glanced away with a frustrated sigh. "Hold on, Liana, I just need to." He turned back one more time, promising, "I'll call you back tonight, okay?" But he didn't. That night came and went, and Liana sat by her phone until midnight, but the call never came. Later that evening, long after Carolyn had gone to bed, Maria climbed the stairs to Liana's room with a granola bar tucked in her apron pocket. She knocked softly, and when there was no answer, she eased the door open and found Liana asleep on the floor, still wearing the maid's uniform, her cheek pressed against the hardwood and her body curled in on itself like she was trying to disappear. Maria's heart broke at the sight, and she knelt down, draping a blanket over the girl's shoulders, and that's when she saw the bruises. Dark purple marks on Liana's wrists where Carolyn had grabbed her too hard, faint welts on her arms from being shoved against door frames. Maria pulled out her phone, her hands shaking, and took 3 photos, the evidence burning in her chest like a secret she couldn't carry alone. She didn't know what she was going to do with them yet, but she knew this. Someone needed to see what was happening in this house, and if Francis Lopez wouldn't listen, she'd find someone who would. She left the granola bar on Liana's nightstand, whispered a quiet prayer in Spanish, and slipped out of the room, already planning her next move. 2 weeks into Francis's trip, Carolyn swept into the kitchen one morning with an announcement that made Liana's stomach drop. "We're hosting a casual brunch this Saturday," she said, her voice bright and airy as she scrolled through her phone. "Just a few friends, nothing too formal, maybe 20 people, champagne, a harpist, you know how it is." She glanced up at Liana, who was standing by the sink washing dishes, her hands red and raw from the hot water, and her smile turned sharp. "And you, darling, will be helping serve." Liana's heart hammered in her chest, and she wanted to protest, to say she couldn't do this, but the words stuck in her throat because she'd learned by now that arguing only made things worse. So she nodded, her eyes fixed on the soapy water, and Carolyn's heels clicked away, satisfied. Saturday morning arrived too quickly. Liana woke before dawn to help Maria set up the garden, arranging white linen tablecloths on round tables beneath the pergola, positioning crystal flutes at each place setting, and making sure the flower arrangements were perfectly centered. By the time the sun had fully risen, the garden looked like something out of a magazine, all soft light and pastel colors and the scent of roses hanging in the air. Carolyn inspected everything with a critical eye, adjusting a napkin here and a chair there, and then she turned her attention to Liana. "Come here," she said, and when Liana obeyed, Carolyn circled her slowly, tugging at the maid's uniform, straightening the collar, and then pulling the apron strings so tight around her waist that Liana gasped and winced. "Perfect," Carolyn said, ignoring the girl's discomfort. "Now remember, you smile, you stay invisible, and you don't speak unless spoken to, understood?" "Yes, Carolyn," Liana whispered, her ribs aching from the pressure of the apron. The guests began arriving just after 11, and they were exactly the kind of people Carolyn surrounded herself with: women in designer sundresses and oversized sunglasses, men in linen shirts with rolled-up sleeves, all of them air-kissing Carolyn and complimenting the garden like they were performing for an invisible audience. Liana moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, and most of them didn't even look at her, treating her like a piece of furniture they had to step around. But one woman, blonde and sharp-featured, paused mid-conversation and stared at Liana a little too long, her brow furrowing. "Wait," she said to the friend beside her, lowering her voice but not quite enough. "Isn't that Francis Lopez's daughter? I saw her at that charity gala last year. She was wearing a Dior dress." Before the friend could respond, Carolyn appeared beside them with a glass of champagne and that practiced smile that never faltered. "Oh, you're so sweet to notice," she said smoothly, placing a hand on Liana's shoulder in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like a warning. Liana wanted to help today, such a sweet gesture, really. She's learning about responsibility and gratitude. It's part of her character development. The blonde woman blinked, uncertain, but Carolyn's confidence was so absolute that she simply nodded and changed the subject, and Liana was dismissed back to the kitchen. The afternoon wore on, and Liana's hands trembled more with each trip back and forth. The exhaustion from 2 weeks of waking at dawn and working until midnight had worn her down to almost nothing, and now the weight of all those eyes on her, even the ones that looked away, made her feel like she was disappearing into herself. She refilled water glasses, cleared plates, and brought out trays of hors d'oeuvres, and with every step she felt like she was walking on a tightrope that was about to snap. And then it did. She was refilling champagne glasses at a table near the pool when one of the guests, a man in his 40s with a loud laugh, suddenly threw his hands up to emphasize a story he was telling. Liana flinched, instinctively jerking back, and the crystal water pitcher in her other hand tilted, and before she could stop it, ice-cold water spilled across the table and straight onto the Hermes bag sitting on the chair beside him. The woman who owned the bag shrieked, grabbing it and holding it up like it was a wounded animal, and the entire garden went silent. Liana froze, the empty pitcher still in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to." But Carolyn was already moving, cutting through the crowd with her face twisted into something cold and furious. She grabbed Liana's wrist so hard the girl gasped, and without a word, She dragged her to the center of the patio, right under the pergola where everyone could see. The harp music stopped mid-note, and the harpist looked up, startled, and then quickly looked away. "You clumsy, worthless little—" Carolyn's voice was low and venomous, and then her hand came up fast and hard, slapping Liana across the face with a crack that echoed across the garden like a gunshot. Liana's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning, and tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of water dripping from the overturned pitcher onto the stone patio. Carolyn wasn't done. She leaned in close, her voice loud enough now for everyone to hear, and said, "You're worthless, just like your mother was." The words hit harder than the slap, and Liana felt something inside her crack wide open, because invoking her mother, the woman she loved and missed every single day, was a cruelty so deep it made her knees buckle. Be real. Is staying silent as bad as doing the harm, yes or no? Type silent is equal to guilty, or not the same, and tell us why. The guests stood frozen, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort, and one woman in the back, younger than the others, reached slowly for her phone, her expression horrified. But Carolyn's gaze snapped to her like a predator spotting prey, and the look in her eyes was so cold, so threatening, that the woman's hand stopped mid-reach, and she looked down at her feet instead. Everyone else followed her lead, turning away, pretending they hadn't seen, pretending this wasn't happening, because acknowledging it would mean they'd have to do something about it, and that was too uncomfortable, too inconvenient. What none of them knew, what even Carolyn didn't realize, was that the security camera mounted discreetly in the corner of the poolside pergola had captured every single second. The lens had followed the movement, the AI system recognizing raised voices and sudden motion as a high-emotion event, and in that moment, it did exactly what Francis had programmed it to do weeks earlier. It flagged the footage, uploaded it to the cloud, and sent an alert directly to his phone. 10,000 miles away, in a hotel suite in Dubai, Francis Lopez's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Back in the garden, Carolyn released Liana's wrist with a shove, and the girl stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her burning cheek. "Go clean yourself up," Carolyn said, her voice returning to that calm, controlled tone she used in public. "And stay out of sight for the rest of the afternoon." Liana didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, her vision blurred with tears, and she didn't stop until she reached the kitchen. Maria was there, drying dishes, and the moment she saw Liana's face, red and swollen and streaked with tears, she dropped the towel and rushed over. "Mija, what happened?" Maria whispered, her hands hovering over Liana's shoulders, afraid to touch her in case it hurt. Liana couldn't answer, couldn't find the words, so Maria just wrapped ice in a clean towel and pressed it gently against the girl's cheek. "This has to stop," Maria said, her voice shaking with anger and helplessness. "This can't go on, Liana, we have to tell someone." But Liana shook her head, her voice small and broken. "He'll never believe me," she whispered. "He loves her and he's not here, and even if I told him, she'd just convince him I'm lying." Maria's heart broke all over again, but she didn't argue because deep down, she was afraid Liana might be right. Outside, the harp music started up again, and the guests returned to their champagne and their laughter, and Carolyn smiled and charmed them all, and no one said a word about what they'd just witnessed. But the camera had seen everything. And soon, Francis would too. It was 11 p.m. in Dubai, and Francis Lopez sat alone in his penthouse suite, the city's glittering skyline stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd been reviewing contracts for the past 3 hours, his eyes burning from exhaustion, but the deal was too important to leave any detail unchecked. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, and he was just reaching for his phone to order another when it buzzed on the marble desk, the screen lighting up with a notification he'd never hoped to see. Security alert. High emotion event detected. His stomach dropped. He tapped the notification, and the app opened to a live cloud feed, and there, in crystal clear 4K, was his garden, his guests, and his daughter standing in the center of the patio with her cheek bright red and tears streaming down her face. Carolyn was in the frame too, her hands still raised from the slap, her mouth moving with words Francis couldn't hear yet because the audio hadn't loaded. His hands started shaking. He pressed play, and the sound came through his phone speaker, tinny but unmistakable, the crack of palm against skin, and then Carolyn's voice, cold and venomous, saying, "You're worthless, just like your mother was." Francis felt the air leave his lungs. He replayed the clip, then again, and with each repetition, the reality of what he was seeing burned deeper into his mind. His daughter, the girl he'd promised to protect, reduced to a servant and publicly humiliated while he'd been 10,000 miles away building an empire that suddenly felt meaningless. The rage that flooded through him was immediate and white-hot, but it was tangled with something worse. Guilt so crushing it made his chest tighten and his vision blur. He'd known something was wrong, he'd seen it in Liana's eyes during that video call, and he'd let himself be distracted, let himself believe Carolyn's reassurances because it was easier than confronting the truth. He didn't think, he just acted. He stood so fast his chair toppled backward, grabbed his laptop, and started canceling meetings, his fingers flying across the keyboard. His assistant called within minutes, confused and concerned, but Francis cut him off mid-sentence. "Cancel everything, I'm going home now." He booked the next available flight to LAX, a red-eye leaving in 2 hours, and then he called his attorney, a man who'd worked with him for 15 years and knew better than to ask questions when Francis's voice sounded like that. "I need annulment papers drafted by the time I land," Francis said, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Grounds. Cruelty, abuse, irreconcilable differences, I don't care, make it ironclad and make it fast." The attorney didn't hesitate. "Consider it done." Francis packed in under 5 minutes, threw clothes into a suitcase without caring what matched, and was in a cab to the airport before midnight. The entire 16-hour journey back to Los Angeles, he didn't sleep, didn't eat, didn't do anything except watch that footage over and over, memorizing every detail, every flinch, every tear, until the images were burned into his brain like a brand. By the time the plane touched down at LAX, his rage had crystallized into something colder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. Purpose. He arrived at the mansion just after 3 p.m. the next day, and to his shock, the garden party was still going. Carolyn had extended it into a sunset cocktail hour, and the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted over the hedges as Francis parked his car down the street and entered through the side gate, moving quietly so no one would notice. He stood in the shadows for a moment, watching Carolyn hold court in a flowing white dress, her smile radiant, her guests hanging on her every word, and the sight of her playing the perfect hostess while his daughter was God knows where made his blood boil. But he didn't confront her yet. Not yet. He pulled out his phone, connected it to the mansion's outdoor AV system, something he'd installed years ago for movie nights and presentations, and navigated to the security footage. The poolside screen flickered to life, and the surround speakers hummed softly, and Francis cued the video to the exact moment of the slap, his finger hovering over the play button. Then he stepped out of the shadows and walked into the courtyard. Heads turned, conversations stuttered to a halt, and Carolyn's smile froze on her face as she saw him. "Francis," she said, her voice bright but strained. "What are you? I thought you weren't coming back until next week." He didn't answer. He just pressed play. The sound of the slap exploded through the speakers, sharp and brutal, and every single person in the garden flinched. On the screen mounted on the mansion's white exterior wall, the footage played in horrifying clarity. Liana standing with a pitcher in her hands, Carolyn grabbing her wrist, dragging her to the center of the patio, and then the slap, so hard the girl's head snapped to the side. And then Carolyn's voice, amplified and inescapable. "You're worthless, just like your mother was." The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests stared at the screen, then at Carolyn, then at Francis, and the horror on their faces was unmistakable. One woman near the back pulled out her phone and started recording. And within seconds, others followed, cameras out, witnesses becoming participants. Carolyn's face went white, then red, and she laughed, a high, brittle sound that didn't match the panic in her eyes. "Francis, this isn't what it looks like. She was clumsy, she ruined a guest's bag, I was stressed, I shouldn't have reacted that way, but—" "Stop," Francis said, and his voice was so low, so cold, that it cut through her stammering like a blade. He stepped closer, and the guests parted to let him through, and when he stood in front of Carolyn, he looked at her like she was a stranger. "You turned my daughter into your servant," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "You dressed her like the help, you worked her until her hands bled, and you did it in the home I built to honor her mother's memory." Carolyn opened her mouth to argue, but Francis pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket and held it out. "Annulment papers," he said flatly. "Signed by my attorney, effective immediately, and a one-way ticket back to wherever you came from. You leave tonight." Her hands trembled as she took the envelope, and for a second, Francis thought she might try to fight, to argue, to turn on the charm that had fooled him once. But then she looked around at the guests, at their horrified faces and raised phones, and she understood that her reputation, her carefully curated image, was already destroyed. The video would be online within the hour, shared and reshared, and there was no coming back from this. Francis turned to the security team stationed near the house. Men who'd worked for him for years and knew exactly where his loyalties lay. "Escort her to her car," he said, his voice steady. "Make sure she takes nothing but her personal belongings, and if she resists, call the police." The guards moved immediately, flanking Carolyn on either side, and she had no choice but to walk with them, her heels clicking on the stone patio one last time. The guests watched in stunned silence, and then, as if on cue, they began gathering their things, murmuring apologies and excuses, phones still out, already texting friends about what they'd just witnessed. Within 10 minutes, the garden was empty except for Francis, and he stood there in the fading sunlight, watching Carolyn's car disappear down the driveway, her taillights blinking once before vanishing around the corner. He exhaled, long and slow, and for the first time in 16 hours, the rage began to ebb, replaced by something heavier, something harder to carry. And then it hit him. He hadn't seen Liana. Panic flooded through him, sharp and immediate, and he spun around, scanning the garden, the house, calling her name. "Liana! Liana!" But there was no answer, only the echo of his own voice bouncing off the walls, and the fear that gripped him in that moment was worse than anything he'd felt watching the footage. He ran. Francis tore through the mansion, calling Liana's name, his voice echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings, but there was no answer, only silence that pressed against him like a weight. He checked her bedroom first, then the library, the living room, the bathroom, every place she might hide, and with each empty room, the panic in his chest grew tighter, sharper, until he could barely breathe. And then, finally, he pushed open the kitchen door, and there she was. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets, still wearing the gray maid's uniform with the apron strings tied so tight they left marks on her sides, and she wasn't crying, wasn't moving, just staring at nothing with eyes that looked hollow and far away. The sight of her like that, small and broken and so completely alone, hit Francis harder than anything he'd ever felt, and he dropped to his knees in front of her, his hand shaking as he reached out but stopped just short of touching her, afraid he might hurt her more. "Liana," he whispered, and his voice cracked, raw with guilt and grief. "Baby, I'm so sorry, I should have known. I should have been here. She didn't respond, didn't even look at him, and for a terrifying moment he thought he'd lost her, that she'd gone somewhere inside herself where he couldn't reach her. But then her eyes shifted, just slightly, and he saw the faintest flicker of recognition, and it was enough. He moved slowly, carefully, and reached for the apron strings, his fingers fumbling as he untied them and pulled the apron away, then helped her out of the uniform jacket, revealing her school shirt underneath, wrinkled and stained with sweat. He held the uniform in his hands, the fabric coarse and ugly, and he looked at his daughter and said, his voice steady now, filled with a quiet, unshakable promise, "You will never wear this again. You are my daughter, not her shadow, and I swear to you, Liana, this ends now." Her lower lip trembled, and she blinked, and for the first time since he'd found her, she seemed to come back to herself, just a little. If there is one line you wish every parent would say after failing their kid, write it below. If nothing comes to mind, like and subscribe to this channel. Francis stood and held out his hand, and after a long moment, Liana took it, letting him pull her to her feet. "Come with me," he said gently, and he led her through the house and out into the garden, where the sun was setting and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. The outdoor fireplace stood in the corner near the rose bushes, a place where they used to roast marshmallows when Liana was small and her mother was still alive, and Francis knelt in front of it now, placing the uniform inside the stone hearth. He struck a match, the small flame dancing in the evening breeze, and he held it to the fabric until it caught, the gray material curling and blackening as the fire spread. Liana stood beside him, watching the flames consume the uniform, and as the smoke rose into the sky, something inside her seemed to break open, and the tears finally came, pouring down her cheeks in silent, shaking sobs. Francis wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she cried, and he didn't try to stop her or tell her it was okay. Because it wasn't okay, not yet, but he was here now, and he wasn't going anywhere. They stayed like that until the fire burned down to embers, and when Liana finally pulled back, her face red and swollen, Francis wiped her tears with his thumb and said, "We're going to fix this together, I promise." Later that evening, after he'd tucked Liana into her bed and sat with her until she fell asleep, Francis found Maria waiting for him in the hallway, her hands clutched around a phone and a small notebook. She looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Lopez, I need to show you something," she said, and she handed him the phone. Francis scrolled through the photos she'd taken over the past 2 weeks. Bruises on Liana's wrists, welts on her arms, her hands blistered and raw, time-stamped and dated with meticulous care. Maria's notebook contained notes in her careful handwriting, documenting every threat Carolyn had made, every moment she'd seen Liana pushed too hard, worked too long, treated like something less than human. Francis's jaw clenched as he read, and when he looked up, he saw the guilt and fear written all over Maria's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I should have called you sooner, but she threatened me, said she'd report me to immigration, and I was scared, but I should have." "Stop," Francis said, his voice firm but kind. "You did what you could, you documented everything, and you stayed here, and you protected her when I wasn't here to do it myself." He handed the phone back to her and met her eyes. "I need you to stay, Maria, as head of household, but I need you to promise me something. If I ever fail Liana again, if I ever miss something I should have seen, you tell me, no matter what, understood?" Maria nodded, relief and gratitude flooding her face. "I promise," she said. "But you have to promise me something too. She comes first, always, not the business, not the deals, her." "Always," Francis said, and he meant it. The weeks that followed were slow, deliberate, and filled with the kind of work that doesn't show up on balance sheets or boardroom presentations. Francis canceled every international trip on his calendar, delegated projects to his VP, and set up a home office so he could work from the mansion and be there when Liana came home from school. He hired a trauma therapist who specialized in childhood abuse, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice who met with Liana twice a week and never pushed her to talk before she was ready. And one Saturday morning, he stood in front of Carolyn's old office, the room she'd used to coordinate her social calendar and plan her parties, and he decided it was time to reclaim it. He spent the entire weekend transforming the space. He brought in painters to cover the walls in soft cream and pale yellow, installed skylights to flood the room with natural light, and filled it with easels, canvases, brushes, and every shade of paint he could find. Liana's mother had been a painter, and though Liana had shown interest as a child, the supplies had been packed away after her mother's death, too painful for Francis to look at. But now, as he set up the studio, he realized that honoring his late wife's memory meant giving their daughter the tools to create her own. When he showed Liana the finished room, she stood in the doorway, speechless, her fingers brushing the edge of an easel like she was afraid it might disappear. "For you," Francis said quietly. "Whenever you're ready." 3 days later, she painted her first piece. A sunrise over the garden, all soft pinks and golds, the light breaking through clouds in a way that felt hopeful, tentative, but real. Francis framed it and hung it above the mantel in the living room, taking down Carolyn's portrait and storing it in the basement. And when Liana saw her painting in that place of honor, she smiled, small but genuine, and something in Francis's chest loosened for the first time in weeks. Her hands healed slowly, the blisters fading to calluses and then to smooth skin again, and at dinner one Thursday evening she told him a story about her art class that ended with her laughing. Really laughing, the sound bright and unexpected and so achingly beautiful that Francis had to look away to keep from crying. 6 weeks after Carolyn left, on a Sunday morning when the house was filled with sunlight and the smell of coffee, Francis and Liana stood in the kitchen making pancakes together. Flour dusted the counters and their clothes, music played softly from the speaker on the windowsill, and Liana cracked eggs into the bowl while Francis mixed the batter, both of them working in comfortable, easy silence. The security cameras mounted in the corners of the room recorded it all, not as evidence this time, but as memory, the kind of moment Francis wanted to hold on to forever. Later, after breakfast, they sat together on the couch, and Liana asked him, shy and hesitant, if he could braid her hair for school the next day. Francis had never braided hair in his life, but he tried, his fingers clumsy and uncertain, and Liana giggled when the braid came out lopsided and uneven, and she gently corrected him, guiding his hands until he got it right. And in that moment, with her hair half braided and her laughter filling the room, the mansion didn't feel like a mausoleum anymore. It felt like a home. The cameras stayed on, but now they captured what mattered. Not the fractures, but the slow, steady work of putting a family back together.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out.